Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome to Africa Evaluation in Indaba. This is our fifth session. We have five sessions in, and it's been really great. It's been really interesting to hear from you, just your input, be it here on these sessions or in our emails or on our post board that we put up or on social media. So we really want to just say on behalf of KAA, thank you so much. And just your enthusiasm, towards transforming the future of evaluation. So we're very excited about that. So today is not any different. We are expecting more collaboration. We are expecting more of your input, more of your experiences and your challenges and whatever it is that you want to share with us. So we're going to start off a little bit differently. We'll start off with a poll just to understand what it is you understand about responsible data and how your organization sees it as well, like how important is it to your organization. So I'm going to ask my colleague Sylvia to put up the poll, and then we'll continue with the conversation. Sylvia, you can put it up, and then we'll give it maybe 2 minutes. So the first poll that we have another poll coming up later on. So the first poll is asking, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is responsible data management and use to you? So 1 being not important at all, and 10 being very important. And I'm going to ask you, this is very anonymous, so I'm going to ask you to be very, very honest in answering this so that we have an informed conversation. The second question is asking, where would you rate your organization or institution in terms of the following? So in terms, I don't have that. It looks like we do not have the options in. Sorry about question 2. I'm going to have to spell it out for you. So question 2, where would you rate your organization in terms of so the following is in terms of data ethics, in terms of data privacy, in terms of data security, and in terms of data governance, and as well as data sharing. So I'll say that again. In terms of data ethics, in terms of data privacy, data security, data governance, and data sharing. So you can just rate from 1 to 10. Okay, so our results are in. So in terms of how important is responsible data management and use to you, it looks like most of us find it very important at 48%, followed by 28% at 9 and 14% at 8. So that is really, really good. Okay, and then the second question, where would you rate your organization or institutions in terms of the 4 that I had mentioned? 8 said, on 8 said 34%, they said they would rate it somewhat very important. And then we have at 5, 28%. So that looks like that's an area that we need to be discussing more on, and that's a note to my panelists. Okay, thank you, Sylvia, for sharing. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of a backstory before we start as to why we are here today and why we thought this conversation would be good for the Indaba. So a little while ago, Meltech, our partner Meltech and ourselves, Meltech represented by my colleague Linda Raftree, we collaborated to start conversations really around the growing interest in the big data economy. So we were going to partner with our country partners and have conversations around responsible data and what the role of evaluators is in that regard. And because of COVID, that didn't happen, of course, but conveniently, Local Evaluation Week was just around the corner. So what we then decided is to have that conversation during Local Evaluation Week. And we had a specific event called How to Conduct Digital Mode During COVID-19. And within that, there was 3 sessions, remote monitoring, responsible data, and as well as data administration. So the conversations were really great. I mean, there was great interest. People had so many questions from what's my role in it? What's the role of the data subject? How do I interpret the data? And what are the different ethics and regulations in terms of different countries that exist as far as data governance is concerned? So we thought at the end of that conversation, our director, Dugan, raised this point and he said, okay, there is so much great interest in this. So, and we can't go away and have this conversation and call it a day. So how about we started a project where we put together a practice guide on good data governance, and how many of you would be happy to join that project? And a number of people raised their hands during that conversation, and they said that they would love to be part of it. And so indeed, after the conversation or after the event, we sent out another call to the wider audience to say, hey, we have this project coming up, and if you want to be a part of it, let us know. And so we had like a great response, like over 50 people across Africa who were very interested in joining the project. And we as TAA, together with Meltech, we had a set of criteria upon which we would define who would be our immediate working group, who we would work closely with on this project. So that working group is the people who are our panelists today, which we will introduce later on. And of course, we would then loop in our wider audience. So we have already started those conversations. And of course, us being here is also saying we don't want to have that closed-in conversation, but we want to hear from you what it is that you want to come out of this, the practice guide. What are your challenges? What are your experiences? And what can we learn based on the challenges that you are experiencing? So I'm going to hand over to Linda Raftree to tell you about the objective of our working group. We call ourselves the RDAN, the Responsible Data in Monitoring and Evaluation Alliance. So Linda, you can take it ahead.
Thanks, Talitha, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing more from you all about how you're thinking about responsible data use in monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. So I work with the CLEAR Center as part of a collaboration that we're doing on this topic. And in my other life, I run a conference called Merle Tech, which looks at the intersection of digital technology and tools and digital data and monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. So I'm collaborating with the CLEAR Center, with Talitha and with Dugan and the working group to take this initiative forward. So what we're hoping to achieve is really to hear from you all. What are some of your experiences? What are your learnings, good practices, and challenges in the area of data governance, data use, data management, when you're involved in your different sorts of activities related to monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. So we have, as Talitha mentioned, we have some working group members who are here on the call today who are going to be working with us to bring forward whatever comes out of this initiative. Today is really the launch to the wider kind of the wider community on this. And what, again, we really want to do is hear from you about what would be the most useful areas for us to focus in on if we were going to be developing guidance, or if we were going to be offering training, or further discussions on some of these really core issues related to how we're managing and governing data in monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. So I'm going to quickly introduce the working group members, and then we're going to hear a little bit from our panelists. Then we're going to have just a wider discussion with all of you, a couple more polls, and see what we can pull out of this group, so that then we can deliver something back to you in the near future that might be useful in your work. So I'm going to open up now to our working group members. I guess we'll start with Jerusha. If you can just quickly say hi and tell us what you're doing here a little bit on this call, and how you're kind of engaged in these topics.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Jerusha Govender. I'm from a small business based in Johannesburg, South Africa, called Data Innovator, where our work is about telling stories with data. And I'm also a legacy board member of SAMIA, the South African M&E Association. So my work has always been in the M&E space, but particularly looking at responsible data use from the lens of data communication. So in the working group, that's really where my passion lies, and where I would be contributing is really looking at what are some of the lessons from a skills development perspective, but also developing useful outputs that enhance how you deliver data to the right people in the right way. So that's me.
Thanks, Jerusha. Monet, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name is Morné Dure. I'm a senior technical specialist at a development consultancy called Genesis Analytics, where we work closely with our clients, and responsible data and data governance is very important when we deal with our clients. We provide data collection services, data analysis, data research, and as Jerusha also mentioned, talking about how we visualize data and make it accessible for clients to use in their decision-making process as well. And I think as also someone who would be at the receiving end of these kind of data protection and responsible data protocols, it's really exciting to hear from the wider community how we can build our skills and knowledge to better manage the data and make sure that when we also collect data, that we do this responsibly. So it's really great to be part of this panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Des, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Des Jason from the National Department of Social Development in South Africa. And as a department responsible for the development of policies and social protection services, the issue of having good quality data to make the right decisions around policies, as well as looking at issues of accountability and target setting is very critical for us. So I'm really great and happy to be part of this discussion. And I will also share some case studies where we had to look around areas of being responsible around especially beneficiary data, which I will talk to later on. Thanks.
Thank you. Rachel, I have you up next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Sebande, and I lead the Data for Development portfolio at the United Nations Foundation within a unit called the Digital Impact Alliance. Within my work, I primarily work towards integration of data from mobile network operators, which does include personally identifiable information. But to enhance development outcomes, I've worked across sectors such as public health, food security monitoring, and disaster management. In terms of my role or contribution to the group is mostly looking into how to leverage the power of non-traditional data sets, such as telco data, to enhance public decision making. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Jessica, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I come to you from the Local Development Research Institute, a Kenyan think tank, which also convenes the Africa Open Data Network. Courtesy of Open Government, I have been involved in the data conversation in Kenya since 2011, and especially with the idea of evidence-informed policy making and with a particular interest in parliaments. That's where I cut my teeth on this. But right now, I'm presently very interested on COVID-19 response, and especially in terms of the response which has entailed women and youth inclusion in the space, and how government is able to assess their data and use it to make better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ilse, you're next.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ilse Flink, and I work as a research advisor for an NGO, an education NGO called VVOB, and I work in Rwanda. Yeah, I'm interested in, well, I'm taking part in this working group because I find it a really important topic. And I feel, having worked in the M&E field in the NGO sector for quite a while now, I feel that it's not sufficiently on the agenda. So I would really like to see if we can get it more on the agenda. And I think this working group is really going to help us with that. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have one more member of the working group, Mark Irura, who is not able to join us today because he is he had a little bit of a family emergency related to yeah, well, none of, don't need to say why, but he had a family emergency, so he's going to try to pop in and out as he can. So so that's the working group, and then Talita and I are working together to kind of steer and support the working group as it moves forward with its work. So we wanted to have some of the working group members just expand on some of the topics that we'll be addressing in the working group. So we'll go into that next, but then after that, we really want you all to contribute with your thoughts on where we should be going or what challenges you're having. So as people are talking, as we're having our first round of kind of panelist interventions, we would love for you to drop into the chat any questions or any comments, any thoughts that you're having, so that we can then pick those up for the discussion after this initial part where we hear from working group members. So we're going to kick off with Monet, who's going to expand a little bit about what are we talking about when we say responsible data governance, what do we really mean, and what do they have to do with monitoring and evaluation, and kind of how she's thinking about those things in her work. So I'll hand over to you again, Monet.
Thanks very much, Linda. Yeah, I think this is a topic that, you know, one can understand in different ways, and I think we experience it differently in our daily jobs. So I think it's very helpful. Yeah, I think I wanted to start off and just say, you know, data is very powerful, but we need accurate and timely data for decision making in our daily lives. And it doesn't matter from, you know, which background we are, if we're in government, in the private sector. You know, there's a lot of data around, and the world we live in, there's so much data. And I think especially, as we were saying, from non-traditional sources. So both in terms of the methods that are being used to collect data, but also by the organizations that are now collecting data. And I think for me as a practitioner, it's about how do we determine the quality and the validity of this data? How can we trust the data that's out there? Do we know and understand the methods and ethics that are being applied when we collect the data? And I think this is where the concepts of responsible data and data governance is so important. In my understanding, when we talk about responsible data, it's how we prioritize and respond to these different concepts around the ethical, the legal, the social, and privacy related challenges that come from using these different data sources. Especially when we use it, you know, when advocacy and around social change, when we think about, you know, the power dynamics, when we collect data, the diversity and biases that may arise when we collect data. And then this links to data governance. So when I think about data governance, it's about how my organization actually deals with the data or manages the data that we collect. How do we process that data? How do we use it? What's the integrity of the data? How do we make sure that the data is secure? It's basically around, you know, what kind of standards and protocols have we set in an organization to manage that data? And I think often when I think a bit about, you know, I'm not an IT specialist, but the IT sector often puts in place a lot of these kind of protocols about, you know, business processes, about how to manage data. And I think, Linda, you're going to talk a little bit later about the data cycle, which is a very important part about how we kind of manage our data. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, data protection in practice. And when we do evaluation, it's not easy. It's a process. I think as a practitioner working in a consultancy, it's about the principles that we use when we do, for example, data collection. It's about making sure that we are ethics focused, that we train our data collectors, that we work closely with our local partners, because especially in the time of COVID, they are the ones that are on the ground and can engage with, you know, respondents. Making sure, especially in the time of COVID, that we are ensuring our participants their confidentiality and making sure that they also trust in the data that we are collecting. It's about working harder to build rapport with participants. I think especially as we move towards virtual data collection, that becomes so much more challenging. And I think especially in this time is to become utility focused. So making sure that we're not over collecting data, making sure that we have structured our data collection tools to be to the point and collecting the information that is required. I think I've also experienced in my work as a consultant that there's often a bit of a tension between responsible data and maybe what clients require. So I wanted to mention one example where we are working with an industry body in the financial sector. And for example, one of the requirements of the financial sector charter is that the participants in training would need to provide their ID numbers. And this is very sensitive information. And we have engaged quite extensively with the client to discuss this issue with them and indicate that this kind of information is not something that one can force participants to provide. So I think it's also understanding in the world that we work in that these tensions about responsible data and, for example, client requirements may sometimes collide. And I think, as I mentioned as well, this idea that maybe as a practitioner, we could be, expert in, for example, data quality and working closely with our clients to know when we collect data from vulnerable people that we need to make sure that this data is protected. Also, in terms of data collection, when we collect sensitive information, and encouraging, this idea of including diversity in our data collection tools. So, for example, if we collect information around gender, that we put in options about I prefer not to say or self-identify, and making sure that we include these sensitivities when we're interviewing different populations or respondents. So I think the important thing is here is also not just about the data that we collect, but also the impact of the data that we do collect. And I think there's a need for the whole ecosystem to be educated around these concepts of responsible data and data governance, so that we all have a common understanding when we discuss these concepts, and that we work, I guess, from the same, or sing from the same hymn sheet. And I think, there's various technical things that we as practitioners might be struggling with. For example, data protocols may exist, for example, when there's lots of data. But how do we apply a data protocol in an instance where there is no data, where we have to start sort of from scratch and collect that data? Can we still apply, these principles for small data collections? Is it important to do that? If we, collect, if they still, in the time of COVID, we were saying we're collecting all this information virtually, but in the past, there's been a lot of, for example, government administrative data that's in hard copy. What is the data security around that? How do we keep copies of these surveys? National statistical offices often had large warehouses where they kept these surveys for many years, but what do we do as practitioners when we've got a hard copy of a survey? How do we make sure that that data is protected? Or how do we, as non-technical kind of IT specialists, data privacy specialists, none of us maybe have those skills. How do we, for example, navigate when we look at different data collection tools? Can we compare their privacy requirements? Is there some kind of checklist that says, okay, this is what you should be looking at when you compare different data collection tools to compare their privacy requirements? So as I say, I think it's not just for us as evaluators to understand the issues around these, but also, as I say, the broader society, the broader community about how we build knowledge around these topics. And I do really believe that our working group, the Responsible Data and Monitoring and Evaluation Alliance, can hopefully support practitioners across a wide range of sectors to provide them with the practical tools and guides on how to improve data governance. Also to think about responsible data when we design evaluations. And I think especially in the time of COVID, it is important because remote data collection has brought around a lot of different requirements and placed burdens on different sectors, and especially I think government, to collect data, and maybe we can build on international practices, but also bring in our practical examples that we have, gathered through our work, and build, therefore, practical examples about how we can, implement these principles and guidelines. So yeah, I think hopefully there's some things for people to think about. I think there's, as I say, challenges, but lots of opportunities to learn from each other. Thanks very much, Linda.
Thanks, Monet. A lot of really interesting points there, and we have a few comments coming in that maybe the panel can think about, or folks on the call if you have experiences for when we go into the discussion. So we have questions or comments coming in from Asghar, thinking about how responsible data cuts across the whole organization. It's not just one person or one team's responsibility. It doesn't only fall to monitoring and evaluation. It has elements of IT, elements of legal, data rights, participation. It includes the management culture. So, it's not just a one-stop shop. It's really thinking about how a lot of different teams can kind of contribute, and kind of how we develop this culture of data responsibility. And then Yindra has asked about our photographs. Is a photograph actually data? And I think yes, because most photographs are digital now, and we also have narratives that we're sharing around that people have provided with us. So I think photographs and narratives could be part of this. And then we have a comment from Taruna thinking about what about GIS and data mapping, and how do we manage data protection around geolocation data. So I think those are all really, really important points that we can elaborate on as we go forward in today's discussion, but also as we're starting to think about what are the things that we would want to include in any type of guidance we would produce. So I'm going to move over to Jerusha now, who's got some thoughts she wants to share as well on this topic. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Monet, and I totally resonate with the points that you shared, particularly the point around us moving to a more utility-focused data producers and disseminators. But what I wanted to share is just firstly, like, what is my kind of understanding of what data governance and responsible data means, or like what's its importance as an M&E professional. And when I think about the topic or these two areas, what it is really to me is that it's about creating parameters, or it's either at a personal level or even at an organizational level, is creating parameters that ensures that we are ethical, we are fair, and we are utility focused in the way we use and produce data, whether it's in monitoring, evaluation, or the learning, and even in the research as well. So I think it should be something that cuts across those areas, and it's really putting that ethical element at the heart of it. And the governance and the being responsible is just the behavior and documenting how we can do this. And as an M&E professional, ultimately we are dealing with data throughout the data value chain, or the cycle that I know Linda will share. And I'm finding that as the field grows, as technology grows in parallel or kind of accelerating past us, is that we've got this like rapid scale of generating data, generating information. And as the individuals responsible for using this in our practice, it's very easy for us to get lost in the woods. And we also make assumptions around what others within our team know about what it means to be responsible, what data governance is, and we kind of, speed off ahead with our evaluation or the output that we're working towards. And there are many risks with that, because it means that we haven't really considered throughout this value chain where we've actually built a possible problem where we might have created a hole where data may be generated in an inappropriate way or is disseminated in an inappropriate way. So we really need to be thinking critically as we move around the cycle or the value chain, whichever kind of model that you look at. What are we putting in place so that we don't get lost in the woods, that we're starting to create a more kind of organized frame for us to operate in this complexity and changing and managing the risks that are arising. And as I mentioned, my particular interest in the data space is around the data communication. And I think if we just zoomed into one space, just in one space, you could identify possible practices for responsible data, but also potential data governance policies needed just in that one area. And you could then extrapolate and see it kind of throughout that chain. And when I think about data governance and responsible data in the space of the data dissemination or the point of data use, some of the questions that come to my mind is, when we are evaluating or generating data, have we really considered who's the user of the data? We're generating a report for a client or an individual, but actually who needs to access this? Have we made provision for the information going back to the individual or individuals that have provided the data to me? Are we communicating in a way that it can actually be used in decision-making, or is it too complex in a manner that we've created an output, but actually we're not being responsible in ensuring that it can be assimilated by the right person or in the right way? So yeah, and even have we built the skills for individuals to do that? Have we thought about if the person that needs to access the information may not understand my odds ratio or my correlation? Have I put in place ways to communicate that in a way that I can ensure that can ultimately be used in the right decision? Because by not putting in place those parameters for myself and for my team means that we are not behaving responsibly in our output of our data or evaluation. And so some ways that we've started thinking about how can we be intentional in being responsible data producers and users in our work is making sure that, you know, we intentionally build skills. So it's looking at ways of making sure that even though I might develop a complex study or evaluation, what efforts have I put in place to build the capacity of the users of the data, whether it's a training or sharing of information or communicating in a space like this where we are sharing lessons. What considerations have I put in place in even the design of my work? And so we've recently had a project which was related to disability, and we had to think quite critically about just the icons that we are using and not use even those small moments, like treating those lightly, that actually we need to ensure that we are representative, we are inclusive. Have we thought about that in the way we presented, presented information? And even using things like sense-making sessions, have we created opportunities where the providers of the data, as well as the users of the data, had a fair opportunity to engage with it, validate it, draw in, or be part of the insight generating? So I think that there are various practices at every point in the data value chain that exist. Some of them are more, you know, this tacit knowledge sitting with individuals. But I think that the working group and these kinds of conversations are a great space for us to start interrogating at every point. What are we currently doing that others can do, but also what have we not thought about yet that should be in place, so that as evaluators, we're not lost in the data governance language and responsible data, but have practical ways of acting on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerusha. So we have another comment coming in from the chat that's asking about how are we really defining some of these different terms and concepts? So I think we often throw around the idea of data protection, data responsibility, data governance, data management, data use. And so I think that's one thing that we would like to explore in this project that we're working on, is how do we ladder those different terminal. So I put in the chat this kind of concept of responsible data that we're using, and really something that goes beyond data privacy and protection. It includes principles. It goes beyond the legal. It goes beyond the legal to think about principles, processes, tools. We're thinking about safeguarding and ethics and effectiveness. We're also thinking about quality. Do we have the right data quality? How are we governing our data? What are the wider effects in society of data collection, use, and management? So it really centers on safeguarding of the individuals who are providing data, or whose data we're capturing and collecting. So those are some of the concepts that the collaborative project, those are open to definition, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit more on this call, what are some of the further elements maybe around responsible data. I'll put in a definition that we've been tentatively using for data governance as well. But first I want to pass over to, who's next? I think Des. Des is going to talk to us about some really kind of concrete cases or issues that she's run into and how they're dealing or how they're addressing some aspects of data governance and data protection and data responsibility in her work. So I'll go over to you, Des.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So I have mentioned before that I work for a policy making department in South Africa. And the issues of responsible data and data governance is very critical, especially within the policy development space. I just need to click out of this. I don't know why this happened. Within the policy development space, as well as implementation across the entire life cycle. With our department, we play a very critical role in terms of social protection measures. So we do have data of especially vulnerable people in the country. So within the broader context, in the country, we do have laws and data policies around personal protection of data, which was established about a year ago, so it's fairly new. And the main purpose of the information regulator and that department or unit is housed within the Department of Justice is the protection of personal information, and we call it the POPI Act. So it is an act, there is a law, and it has been passed within cabinet. So I'll make an example of what we experienced recently now, that we wanted to measure what was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially on the social and economic environment. So as government, we then implemented a special 350 COVID grant. So we wanted to do a rapid assessment to see that how is the grant utilized by beneficiaries and what are the implementation challenges around the 350 grant, because there was lots of issues in the newspapers on a daily basis. So we wanted to look at issues around verification. Was the verification done of the information of beneficiaries that applied across government on all other databases? And then we also wanted then to be able to see then how was how did households utilize the 350 grant. So firstly, we then had to apply for permission to the information regulator. And we then got exemption to utilize the personal data on the basis of that it was going to be utilized for empirical evidence, and that we also had to be very clear that we would then discard the information at the end. But then they also gave us very clear instructions that we could not utilize the names, the surnames, the ID numbers, and the addresses of the beneficiaries. We could only utilize their cell phone number. So we just had to be very creative when we designed the study. Then for us, that was a great lesson as well to learn. Then on the other aspect of administrative data. So as a country, we want to be able to share especially social protection administrative data to improve well-being of citizens. So we have embarked on a program which has started off about 3 years ago, and it's called the National Integrated Social Protection Information System. And here we also work very closely with the Office of the Information Regulator to ensure that when we share information with other departments, at a local level, at a provincial level, the integrity and what they are going to utilize the data for is very clear. So we have got in certain protocols in place where we have to have SLAs and MOUs as to how the data will be utilized and what are the conditions of the sharing of this data. So I think that is what I would like to share then. Thanks.
Thanks, Des. So I think some of those really practical challenges about data use and data reuse that are coming up are really also really important to unpack in this call and this event, and also as we go forward to looking at what kinds of guidance we might be able to put together. We have a few more things that have come in the chat, which I think is a really, really core point, or what are the different tools that that could be used to improve data protection and data security. So should we be using Dropbox? Should we be using other tools? So we can put that kind of on the list. And this really critical issue of power, I think for me that really underpins all of this work around data and data protection as we see data becoming, in some cases, a commodity, as we see that we're going digital, that we're using digital tools to collect data. It makes it much more difficult to kind of enter into a relationship with the person that we're collecting data from if we're trying to do things remotely. So there are a lot of issues that are coming up, I think, with COVID data collection, both related to data reuse, to data privacy. And then we have a question coming in, or a comment coming in the chat box as well, around Personal Information Protection Act. So we have POPI in South Africa, and we have other data protection laws that are coming up in other countries as well that need to be complied with. But I think, beyond compliance, when we're talking about responsible data, we're thinking beyond just compliance, because we know in some cases the laws are behind the kinds of data use that are possible out there. And I think Rachel actually, when she speaks to us now about some non-traditional data, there might be ways that we can collect and use data, or data we could access as evaluators, different types of data mining, data techniques that might not even be covered in the laws. And so as evaluators, how are we thinking about responsibility to and ethical issues when we're using new kinds of data? So I'm going to hand over to you, Rachel, if you want to tell us a little more about non-traditional data sources, mobile network operator data, call detail records, that sort of thing that you might be using. And how are you thinking about that in terms of responsible data, in terms of data governance?
Thank you, Linda, and thanks for having me today. So like I mentioned earlier, my work cuts across the integration of non-traditional data sources, particularly data from mobile network operators in the form of call detail records, but also including satellite imagery data, as it is combined with traditional data sources across various sectors of development. It could be digital health data, or it could be data on the population, or other demographic elements. But the whole purpose is to enhance public decision-making. So I work with governments, with NGOs in various countries, supporting their utilization of a combination of these non-traditional and the traditional data sets to answer key questions across development areas such as public health, food security monitoring, and disaster management. Now, in terms of responsible data use, most of these non-traditional data sets that we use, like if you put case in point call detail records, they do encompass a lot of personally identifiable information. And some of the elements that we have been looking at in our work, number one is to understand the legal frameworks, data sets. Having said that, countries, particularly on the African, yet to develop those. And so in those sort of situations, these are entities that are often mandated to have oversight on utilization storage of such data. And tried to ascertain whether there are provisions within the various diverse legal instruments that already exist. For example, maybe a country could have an e-Transactions Act or a Cybersecurity Act or an ICT policy, just to mention a few, where there are bits and pieces of guidance on how to utilize these non-traditional data sets in a safe and responsible way. But ultimately is to also establish safeguard rails or guidelines for ensuring that data can be used in a safe and responsible way. And I know I keep referring to safe and responsible. I just want to highlight, some of the nuances around what encompasses safe and responsible use for us. So first of all is to focus on whether the use case for which we are putting this non-traditional data sets to use is key and it solves a bigger problem, whether there's a cost-benefit analysis for doing that, and ensuring that ultimately we're doing no harm and acknowledging that there could be other demographic segments, like let's say, for example, older women or children and those marginalized and poor communities, perhaps that do not have access to mobile phones, who are not represented in this sort of data sets or data analysis. What then becomes important is to acknowledge the fact that we still need secondary data sources to triangulate for populations that may not be represented, for example, in a mobile network operator data set. The other aspect is also to look into the methods that are undertaken in accessing the data, cleaning the data, processing the data, and visualizing the data, ensuring that we are using non-biased algorithms as we analyze this data, ensuring that the data is anonymized before it is processed, preferably if it is anonymized within the telco environment, and ensuring that data does not leave the geographic jurisdiction of a country within which use cases are being deployed. Lastly, I also wanted to make mention of the importance of then building the local capacity. When we say we are enhancing safe and responsible use, we also incorporate the aspect of building the local capacity of both the government entities, national statistic offices, because as you know, these the ultimate stewards of these data for development initiatives. So building holistic skills across the board, from technical partners at the local level, government partners, national statistic offices, and even the regulatory authorities. For us, this is what, utilizing non-traditional data sets like mobile network operator data in a safe and responsible way looks like. Very, very, very lastly, to mention that the data that we use is aggregated. So what that means is we are not looking at any individual level data. We are not looking at a core data record of Elinda somewhere in the middle of Tanzania or Malawi, but we're looking at aggregated data sets, particularly that help us to understand population density and migration patterns of people in the short term or the long term, and what that means in terms of delivery of health services, or in terms of accessing food security outcomes, or indeed in terms of displacement of people during a natural disaster, just to mention a few examples.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So I think that we have a pretty broad range of experiences. We've heard from government, we've heard from UN Foundation, we've heard from private consulting firms that are all dealing with different kinds of issues with data governance and responsible data. So we want to share one slide just to kind of give you a picture of how we're thinking about data and sort of the data life cycle in case people aren't familiar with it. I'm just going to pop it up on the screen really quickly. And then we want to open up into a broad discussion. So I think there are so many great comments that have come in already. So we would love to hear more from folks on the call. about your thoughts, about what your considerations are, about some of the comments that have come in. So let me just try to share this one slide if I can find it now. It's not coming up for me. I'm just going to forget about sharing the slide because it's not coming up easily in my screen. But when we think about the data lifecycle, I think it's sometimes helpful to think about the cycle of data, and it doesn't mean that it's a cycle that's a linear cycle that goes from beginning to end, but it's a cycle that sometimes you have to return back and redo things. So we're talking about when you're maybe I can still share it. 1 second. There we go. So this is the one that I wanted to share and talk you through. So if you can see the data lifecycle really goes from design and planning to collecting and accessing data. And when we say collect or access, it could be in a situation where you're accessing this type of data that someone else has already collected, like MNO data, or it could be that you're using open data. So that's when we're thinking about collecting and accessing. Transmission and storage is another area that we think about in terms of data management and data protection and data security. That involves using encryption, for example, or thinking about, is the way that you're storing data safe? Who can access data that you're storing? And then when we have some of these new legislations that are out, they sometimes restrict which country data can be stored in. So there are some aspects that we think about in terms of transmission and storage. Cleaning and analyzing data are processes that are also critical to making sure that we have quality data. When we think about analyzing data, we're thinking about if the data has bias in it, or if we have the skills to analyze the data we do have. We find a lot of times organizations collect lots of data, but they don't have the skills and capacity to actually use it. So we're collecting, and the data is just kind of sitting somewhere, and we're not even really using it. So that's another angle that we want to think about. Sharing data is another critical piece. Who are we sharing data with? Do we have agreements about whether we're sharing it, how we're sharing it, what it can be used for, what it can be reused for? Thinking about visualizing and communicating. That's in terms of, are we, sometimes when we use infographics, we're cherry picking data to make certain points or to show only certain parts of something that might be part of a particular agenda. So thinking about how we visualize, how we communicate data, both in very understandable, user-friendly ways, but also ways that are, that they were showing some integrity in terms of what we're visualizing, because that does change decisions sometimes. And then data retention, data maintenance, and data destruction. A lot of times we don't even imagine that we would destroy data, but there are things that we want to do with data. We want to aggregate it, we want to anonymize it, de-identify it, and sometimes destroy it if it's no longer going to be used. So when we think about responsible data, we think about data governance, there's a whole life cycle of data, and each one of these points, there are different actions that we want to take in order to make sure that data is protected, and that we're thinking about the ethical uses of it. So that is just something I wanted to share with everyone as we're thinking about more responsible data governance. At which different stages do we want to be careful, or do we want to start to think about what protections we have in place? So we're going to kind of open it up now in terms of discussion. There are some folks that have already mentioned really critical points in the chat. So I wanted to call on some of you just to expand on your points if you're interested in doing that. Let me get my list of people who have already had some comments to make in. I think, sort of this big picture question, maybe, I think, Brian, you had some really interesting points. I don't know if you're interested in and jumping in and expanding on some of the points around data governance that you raised, and the way that the current laws are actually not always covering all the things that they would need to. Let's see if I can see my gallery. Do you want to jump in, Brian? You can also let me know in the chat if not. That's Brian Tahuma. I don't hear you, Brian, so maybe I'll go to someone else if maybe you're not interested in saying it out loud. But Brian's got some quite interesting points in the chat. Who else was speaking? Asghar, I don't know if you want to pop in with some of the thoughts that you've mentioned.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I think from my side, a lot of these questions have surfaced because of going through the process of having to establish, or with a team of people, establish a data governance committee within the organization and trying to align with the papaya regulations in South Africa. So I guess, I mean, the comments that I've shared is based on the process that I've gone through of saying that data isn't just the responsibility of people working in M&E, but it's an organizational process, and to get people, I guess, aware of how they need to be managing information is part of the challenge, and also to build that organizational culture. Part of our challenge is also when we work with vulnerable groups of people, in our case, young children and young adults. It's about how do we safeguard the information and only use it for what we need to use it for. So it does also require us doing a lot of explaining why we're collecting data, how it's going to be used, and where the data ends up being reported on. I guess part of our challenge still is how do we maintain our objectivity, but also in explaining why we're collecting data, create that space for participatory, participatory involvement of our program participants, because they should also have a say in how they inform the data collection agenda, and how their voices come through in how the data is interpreted as well. So that's just my comment on, expanding on what I mentioned earlier.
Thanks so much. I might put Jessica on the spot here, because I know, Jessica, you have raised this issue of bringing young people and thinking about women and sort of participation and inclusion in the data process. Jessica is also a member of our working group. Is there anything you want to pipe in with in terms of greater participation of youth and women, Jessica? Yeah, we can hear you.
My internet. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so yeah, thanks for calling me. Two things I want to identify. For the youth, they are releasing their data without even thinking, through a lot of their adoption of tech. And given that our continent is young, we are letting our data just go beyond our jurisdictions. And our governments are unaware about how, to protect us from this. And that becomes an issue of the conversation we need to be having with the young people, given that they are also the early adopters of data, of tech, and a lot of the data is being collected virtually using tech. On the other side, we also need to discuss about the tools being used. I saw somebody raise this issue earlier, because the tools being used, if they are not open source, so they become that the data is accessible to other people to use without it being collected twice or thrice through various tools, which are have got proprietary considerations. I think that's an issue to, especially where government is concerned, that maybe they need to push for. Looking at what has happened during COVID, there are so many different organizations that have come to the fore to help with the health conversations in various countries. And the government have been very quick to adapt, but not really guided by policy. And I know so many times policy is always behind the process of new innovations, and the technology and innovation space is one particular one. And so for this one, we need to also discuss what kind of things, opportunities has COVID given to government to reinvent itself in terms of how it manages data, given both locally and also internationally. And it's been interesting to be part of conversations, especially about the response in Kenya. And we've seen that the women have been right in the center of our conversation, in terms, not conversation, the response, but their data is hardly available. And in fact, they are being disregarded in the policy considerations. Everybody's talking about big business or small business, but not really thinking about the woman at the household level. Yet with high unemployment, they are the ones bearing the brunt of it. And in our context where they do not own the land, they end up being more like beasts of burden, and having no way to really advocate for themselves without data. So yeah, a few things. I'm not sure I've responded to everything, some of the things that have come up on the chat, but definitely an interesting conversation and opportunity for research.
Thanks so much, Jessica. We have some really interesting additional comments that have come in. We have Chazanga and also Taruna that I wanted to call on. I'm sorry if I'm putting people on the spot. Would you like to kind of come in, Taruna, and speak a little bit about some of the challenges of consent that you're finding in your work or in general?
Hi, Linda. Sure. I don't have any coherent thoughts, like you can see, I'm just putting some random things that are popping in my head. But probably about consent, I think that I was reading on Al Jazeera, and I think a few of you might have seen that article of where people, they were, I don't know if it's verified now, they were saying that the US military had bought data about Muslim people, and it was this whole thing of, no, it's not been done, yes, it's been done. And I was just thinking back to some of the work when we collected from the field and this data about consent. I don't have any experience of really explaining to people that, yes, we are taking all this information from you, but that power of that information, how it can be used and things. So it just made me wonder, after reading that article, is that as evaluators, we're getting this data, and is it the right thing that we're not explaining to people that this data is powerful? I remember reading in The Economist a few years ago that data is the new oil, and like if it's like refined and analyzed, it's a very powerful tool. So I mean, and we can see how Amazon and Facebook sell our data because it shows, you know, user behavior again. So just showing that power. And I mean, I would be scared to really say that, oh, this data can be misused, because people might say, well, I don't want to give you I don't want to speak to you about it. So I just wanted to know maybe from the experts what they've done. I'm an emerging evaluator, so I don't have extensive experience in the area.
Thank you. And I have some thoughts on that, but I think Chizanga was also raising some of those points, and then Brian is also in the chat talking about some of the issues with social media, with the platform data collection. Rachel, you might have thoughts around consent on those two aspects, but I wanted to hear from Chizanga if you're interested in popping in with some of the thoughts you had raised.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, and good day to everyone. Yeah, so for me, I think I would like to sort of get other people's views and perhaps some experiences around. I'm based in South Africa, and we are providing healthcare to HIV positive clients. So we are supporting ultimately the health department. Okay, is providing support in public health, and my role really is strategic information. So I raised the point around protection of personal information because of the new POPI Act enactment in South Africa, which then, tends to treat, NGOs and other government partners as third party to the data. And as such, in the context of COVID, we are confronted with, the issue of getting to disseminate information to clients, firstly, about maybe sending reminders on their appointments and also scheduling for medication pickup, for example. Okay, and that requires quite a lot of personal information, such as, name, sex, address, and so on and so forth, including maybe folder number. But then that now is one process in the public healthcare provision, then gets really inhibited, because you're now having to trade how much of information can we give maybe a call center to send out mass SMS to remind clients of their medication pickups and so on, or appointment scheduling. So that is one challenge we're actually facing, and it has a huge impact in terms of doing longitudinal data analytics. So we are unable to analyze data longitudinally because a lot of key variables are missing around the patient. So that is one area, and the other area is that we also have quite a lot of information that we send out on social media platforms. Either it could be reminders or just information to educate people. Being able to quantify all of that, and that's where I asked to say, could anybody maybe have access to a tool or various analytic tools that people can use, and this information then becomes reliable, because I tend to think anyone can post anything on social media, but how do you decipher what is true and what is appropriate, what is correct? Yeah. I think that for me, in my 2 cents on this discussion, thank you. Cool.
And so we have issues of data quality and sort of what's, how real is the information that's coming in from social media. And then we've also raised on the call issues of I think I've come across in my work a lot. Do we encourage people to use social media as part of our evaluation? Are we using Facebook tools? Are we using, WhatsApp in evaluation? And then what does that mean for the data that we're encouraging people to provide to these private companies and tech platforms? So they're really kind of tricky ethical questions, which is why, I think when we talk about responsible data, we're going beyond this just sort of compliance and thinking about what are the ethical implications of the choices that we make as evaluators in data collection. So I appreciate that. I wanted to see if Rachel had any thoughts around, how do you manage consent if you're accessing cell phone data, or if you're using satellite data? And then we have another poll that we want to put up for you in a couple minutes as we start to close out, to kind of get your feedback on what specific areas we might want to work on in this piece that we're going to be developing. So over to you, Rachel, and then Sylvia, if you would get the next poll ready, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. So in the countries where we've worked, in terms of issues of consent around using aggregated telco data, we have leveraged legal provisions or frameworks that have articulated to say that that sort of data can actually be used only if it is for public good, with the leadership of a government entity. Now, suffices to say that there have also been countries where we've worked where those provisions are not available, and we've not been able to actually use that data because the definition of consent is grounded in extending that mandate to the individual person. So I imagine it's a very contentious discussion whether governments and whether regulation or legal instruments should overstep that right of a person to give consent and make determinations of what encompasses public good, to the extent that it shouldn't require an individual's consent for such data sets to be utilized. So I think that's what I can say around the issue of consent and utilization of telco data from experience. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to go really quickly to Ilse and also recognize what Yindra has put into the chatbot. That really, I think evaluators and most of us that want to work with data are in a really tricky spot, because the more granular the data, the more personal the data, the more geolocated the data, we assume that the better quality the data is, and the more accountable we might be. For example, if we're working on social protection, a lot of times we have to save, organizations have to save lists of beneficiaries with all kinds of personal data. So it's really a balancing act, I think, between collecting granular data to the point that it's useful, and then aggregating data or depersonalizing data so that it's more protected. And that's this, kind of balancing act that we're doing as evaluators all the time. And there isn't a lot of, kind of specific guidance that works in every single case. And so sometimes it is up to, I think, evaluators to be ambassadors. And Ilse, I wanted to know, do you want to, sort of say your thoughts on that piece, and then we'll go to the poll?
Yeah, nothing specific to add, but just, what you're saying. I mean, I think we have that hat on to ensure that even when our managers tell us, please publish it, or when our donors are asking information from us that we don't want to share, that we don't feel like we're being put under pressure, but that we ensure that we do stick to these principles and comply with them, and that we act as ethics ambassadors and stand up to people that do put us under pressure. I'm not saying that's easy, because I know the power dynamics, and especially power dynamics between donors and between implementing partners. But just as we safeguard the quality of data, we should also safeguard the ethics of data as evaluators.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, I think we have two, probably more than two, but in the work that I do, which is usually around helping organizations be more responsible and implement data policy, what I've seen is that we're starting to get our heads around more traditional, what I would call like traditional or linear data collection. So people are starting to really think about, how do we manage data when we go out and collect it, when we do a survey, when we're kind of directly interacting with someone whose data we're collecting. And that's kind of one pathway for thinking about data responsibility. But then this other kind of emerging non-traditional data, social media data, cell phone data, big data, has a very different kind of pathway that a lot of us, self-included, don't completely understand how it all works. So when we're engaging in public-private partnerships, when we want to use data that might be collected by a private sector organization, or when the private sector wants to work with us in a partnership in order to collect data they might not normally have access to. There are a lot of really tricky kind of ethical issues and situations that we come up against that are still in the process of being worked out. So those are some of the things that I hope we can look at in the work that we're doing going forward. I wanted to have us put the next poll up to see, to get some feedback from you. This is really a poll that's trying to, try to narrow us down a little bit. What are the, top 5 areas that you would like guidance on? And if there's, okay, well, it's missing an other. So if there's an other, we're going to be picking from the chat box. But if you want to drop in the chat any other areas that we haven't mentioned here on the poll, please do drop those into the chat so that we can draw from all of your ideas as we're narrowing down in the specific areas that we have the capacity to unpack in this current work that we're doing. And I might sort of call on Dugan now to kind of think about, how does this process look going forward? So while you're filling out the poll, we'll give you a couple minutes to do that and see what comes back. And then And then I'll hand over to Dugan maybe to talk a little bit about what CLIR is thinking about going forward. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Dugan, but I will anyway. So take a couple more minutes on the poll and then we'll see what your thoughts are. And Talitha, would you be sharing, or Sylvia, would you be sharing it? Okay, great. All right, so we can see it's a pretty even spread across across all of the different areas. Looks like our lowest interest is in data quality and systems interoperability, and I'm guessing that might be because those are some areas that we've already been working on, maybe. And then, yeah, okay, understanding privacy laws, research ethics, remote monitoring, managing consent, protecting data along the full life cycle. Okay, great. And then using non-traditional data sources. So it's a very even spread, I think, across all of these different areas. And as I mentioned, would love to have you all, if there, as we close out, if there are other areas we haven't mentioned in this poll that you feel are missing, please do put those in the chat so that we can pull those into the work that we would be thinking about doing going forward. So I think we can take the poll down, and then I'd love to hear some thoughts from Dugan from CLIR about really thoughts about where do we go from here, and how do we make sure that we're bringing all of this together into our next phases. Dugan, over to you. You might be, okay, there you go.
Oh dear, I haven't got my corporate background up. People won't know where I work. There we go. So Linda, thank you so much. Your care and your enthusiasm has been invaluable so far, and we hope that we can continue to count on you as a partner. But it's not just been you, it's also been Talitha, who's worked so very, very hard, and the working group whose contributions we continue to value. When we think about evaluation and we take account of the enormous drive to transform it and to make it better fit for purpose, we really are encountering a lot of the kind of dynamics that Brian's been raising in the chat box, which is kind of like, it's really hard to address this stuff if you are somebody whose data is being taken from you. And we are really at CLIR AA wanting to play a role as a convener and a steward in the African evaluation space. We want to be really taking account of what it means to be an ethical practitioner in Africa. Not anywhere else, in Africa. What are the issues that we encounter as Africans, and how do we build the field to respond appropriately? When I was in DC last year, and I was talking to some of big shots in evaluation at a major institution, they were all about big data and machine learning, and they were all about how we need to put these big systems in place that use algorithms and are able to draw inferences. And it kind of made me very anxious. And so what the Indaba is about is creating a space to start the conversation, but then we're intending to sustain it. We want to build a discussion over the 2021 calendar year. A big moment in the discussion is going to be the data training program. And I'm thinking that we maybe need to add something into data about data governance and some of the consent and privacy issues, and start making this very much part of our curriculum and the standard conversation we have when we talk about evaluation in Africa. So Talitha, if you could put the link to the notice board in the chat box so people can post their comments, tell us what you think, tell us how you want to stay engaged. So Linda knows that our intention is to release a publication that serves as a guideline that is trying to span a number of audiences, from beginners who are trying to just get their head around what does this landscape look like and what are the big topics, through to actually the sophisticated practitioners who are already working in the space and who need a manual or a reference that they can cite, that they can say, these are the standard guidelines and the practice that I'm following is recommended there. Africa is a very diverse and complicated place. I don't know if that's something that we can do that speaks to that whole area. We might have to cut it up into smaller tasks. We may need to make it more appropriate for certain contexts, but that's our agenda. That's where we're trying to head to with this. We're very excited to be building a community of practice. The conversation in the chat box has been on fire as usual over the Indaba. The chat box has been, I think the chat box is the single best thing that came out of COVID. So I'm grateful to the pandemic for that. But please continue to engage with us. Please give us direction. We want to be understood to be an institution or an entity that is part of its community, that receives its that gets a mandate from its base. And we're wanting to be operating in that kind of a way. So thank you very much for being everybody here. And I'm going to return to, give you back to Linda. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dugan. And it's yeah, I've been really enjoying the conversation as well. As we close out, I just want to thank our working group members who have been present on the call and have been, helping us think behind the scenes about where we need to focus on things, and really also helping us to have a broad type of input from different types of institutions, different types of approaches to data gathering and monitoring and evaluation. So it's really been invaluable to have the working group pulled together. I do want to hand back off to Talitha to kind of close this out. But first, just from my side, thank you so much for being on this Indaba today. And I've learned a lot from you all. And now over to Talitha.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, everyone. I think you guys said it all. And yes, again, the chat box is amazing. So do engage with us further on the post-board link that we've provided, since we won't have the chat box. But tomorrow we are meeting again for another session, Adaptive Management and Climate Change, with Dugan, Stephen Masvaure, as well as Professor Patricia Rogers. So join us tomorrow. That's going to be in the morning at 9 a.m. And then on Thursday, we'll have our last session where we wrap up everything we've discussed so far. So you don't want to miss that last one as well. So thank you so much, and we will see you tomorrow.